They call me 594. 594. Well, I think for all of you that remain, even though you knew I was back this afternoon. But as Michael so eloquently presented the outline of most of my lessons this morning, we'll say just kidding, only part of it. However, a portion of what this is introduction to Exodus 15 and 17, where I'm going to spend a lot of my time, and then try to tease some thoughts from that and some applications we can have for our lives as we look at what the Lord has given us. And so, as I looked at this, and you give me enough time to work on a lesson, I'll write it about 7 times before what actually you see comes forward. But really what I think comes down to this is we're going to talk about water, we're going to talk about the wilderness, and we're going to talk about all the change that came in what we see with this. And so from a perspective of looking at this, and Michael did a really good job of setting up just the idea of that this is a move from slavery to freedom. And that's a huge theme throughout this entire book and throughout our entire lives, because we are moving from slavery to freedom. And so we can take these ideas and these snippets of different applications of what we see with the Israelites, and we can apply them to our lives. When that is something, the older you get, I think, and those of you that are much wiser than me already realize that there's always so many things you can see in these stories that we can apply in our lives. And hopefully today, I'm going to take a little bit of what I've seen in my life and observations I've made, as well as what I see that the Word has shown me, and even through our joint studies that we've been doing over the last several months. So going to where we're at is in 15, in verses 22 through 27, we're going to look at the setup here. Is that just as Michael had said, they've just finished the destruction of the Egyptian armies. And so Moses has brought in 22 Israel from the Red Sea, and then went into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. So we're 72 hours post, probably after the 10 plagues. I cannot imagine this is not the most fundamentally life-changing event that they've all witnessed in their lives. And then 3 days later, humanity shows itself for who we are. Because I would think that they had water. They probably had containers, they had canisters, they had pulled that through, and they're 3 days in, and now they're out of water, and this is what they say. So now when they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah, for they were bitter. And therefore the name of it was called Marah, and the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and when he cast it into the waters were made sweet. So with this, we see just as an example, and we're going to talk about this in the terms of, one, I could spend the entire rest of my lesson just talking about bitterness to sweet and what that means. But the thing is that we have to recognize, and what you take from this is, God led them to waters that were bitter because they were following God. And so for these 3 days they walked, God led them here. God knew what was going to happen. And we need to take, first, that's the first lesson I want to realize, that God leads us to places and he knows what we're going to have to face. He is going to prepare us for things. And then looking at water and being that theme, not too long later, we have the manna, which we talked about, and we'll cover that in a minute. But then we go into 17, and we see another issue with water. And so with that in 17, 1 through 7, I'll read this quickly. And then all the congregation of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandments of the Lord, and camped in Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. And therefore the people contended with Moses. They complained before, but now they're contentious, they're angry, they're mad, and said, "Give us water that we may drink." So Moses said to them, "Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord?" And the people thirst there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why is it that you have brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with this people? Haven't we all been there? Why am I in this predicament? They are almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said to Moses, go on before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your rod, which you will strike the river and go. And behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and the water shall come out of it, and that the people may drink. And Moses did in the sight of the elders of Israel. And so he called the name of the Lord, name of this place Manasseh and Meribah, because the contention of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? So I'll tell you where my mind goes after you read these snippets, and that's a dangerous place for me to tell you where my mind goes. But my initial thing is, what's up with these people? I mean, they have witnessed 10 plagues. They've witnessed the destruction of the Egyptian army. What else do you need to feel, we're good? I think someone that's got our back. I think there's someone in control of things. But you know, the truth is we already know that to be true in our lives, and it doesn't keep us from doing the exact same thing. Every time something presents itself, this is our reaction. And so with that, I started thinking back, and those of you who don't know, I work in healthcare, and I'm in a leadership position, and I don't know how I got there, but somehow I'm there, and people continue to pay me to do that job. Whether it's good or not, I don't know, but I'm still there. And so you see I have some understanding of where Moses is at with this, because I lead a small group of about 200 or so people that have to listen to me, or at least that's the way it's supposed to work, and I'm supposed to tell them what they need to do. And with that, you see a lot of issues would change. Because really in the end, when I look at all these things and trying to find commonality, that's what I see what's going on here. There's change in all these things. And we'll go quickly through these events because Mike already covered these. But we have the waters here, Moriah, that we've talked about. We have the manna in that event. We have the water from the walk and how that presented itself. We have the battle with the Amalekites and the things that brought with it. And then we have Jethro and his council of Moses. And those are kind of the things that happened during this time that we're talking about. But the key things that happened, there was changes that the Israelites were having to endure. And this is our problem. We love change, don't we? I don't know how many hours of leadership training I have taken trying to manage change, which is really an oxymoron because you can do it, but it definitely takes intention. But thinking about with Israel, we already said this, they were slaves, and now they're free. They had autonomy, no autonomy at all, basically had to do whatever they were told, to now that they have some say-so in their lives, and definitely can't point to their people that are holding them captive to being where all their issues are. They have to complain to somebody else. Their political structure is completely changed. They've gone to a place where they were one, and like Mike pointed out, here's a people that go into a nation, they're in a favored state, they grow, they prosper, they're going on, and then they eventually, just in probably the recent years, they get enslaved, but they've been living in a land, in a country, where they have basically lived a really pretty good life. And they've grown, and they're now this multitude of people. And that changed. They had an infrastructure. They were living, Egyptian civilization was one of the most modern, if not the most modern civilization of the time. So they had all of the things that come with that, and now we're living in a desert/wilderness, and there are no porta potties out in the wilderness. But the infrastructure's changed. Their security's different. They had the army of the Egyptians that no one was going to mess with them. They could go wherever they wanted to go. They could do what they needed to do, knowing that the power of Egypt was behind them. Now that is gone, because we just saw it get swallowed up in the sea. And then finally, the biggest thing in my book, their diet just changed. Really believe that they probably lived on a good sustenance of fish and other things that came from the Nile, so they had a diet that we would call balanced and probably really great for the time. And now we're out in the wilderness, and we find out we're eating this stuff that we're picking up off the ground every day. and we may have some cattle, some other things that we're living off of, but really that's all change. These are all changes, and they go from the fundamentals of needs to all the other things that we look at from a day-to-day life that we depend on to be there for us in one way or the other. And so with that, I'm going to take all that leadership training and I'm going to give you a 5-minute synopsis of change management and what is observed with that. And so with this curve, and what you see here is a change curve, and it's a psychologist put this together, and it's based a lot on the grief, management of grief, but change management, and it has certain aspects to it that I think we can apply to this. So if you see the up and down there is the mood, and the higher the elevation, the better the mood is. The lower you are on the mood scale, the more negative your mood is. And then time is what it is. It's progression over time. And so when you have any kind of change or anything that comes into your life, into your business, into anything, there's some general principles, and we see this with the Israelites, and I think it helps us to understand where they come from. And the first thing is you're sitting there, and someone says things are going to change, and you go, no, they're not. No, we're going to keep this as much as we can the same way it is right now. I live this every day at work because I'm always introducing the change that is coming. And every day, and some change I've been talking about for 10 years, and I'm still talking about it. And there's people thinking, this isn't going to happen. I said, well, it already has. You're just further behind than everybody else. We just need to move along. But you have this denial, and it's real, and all of us do it. It's not like anyone's immune to it. I was in denial of things about the stuff I was talking about when they gave it to me because I didn't want to talk about it. I don't want to tell anybody about this. There's nothing great about this. But anyway, we have denial. Then the next thing you go to is anger. You're just mad. You just resent the fact that the change is coming, and you just get angry. I mean, and people can hang out there for a long time. You can sit there. You can go back to denial, then go back to anger, go back to denial. I've got people that I've worked with that have done that. They still haven't got past anger and the change of things. Then you go into bargaining. So once you kind of throw your fit, and that doesn't get you anywhere, then you try to negotiate. Well, if we do this, can I do that? If we do this, do I do that? Can I get somewhere in this? And so you try to bargain through things. And then finally, you hit the valley. You're just depressed because the change is happening. You've kind of consoled yourself to the point to know that this is where it's going to be. And the Eeyore comes out. And then you got the whining. And the whining. And then they may backslide to anger for a bit. And then they slide back to whining. But this is how we, as people, react to change. And then at some point, as you notice your mood improves, eventually some people decide to accept it. Some people don't. They're no longer with the organization usually at that point because they decide they don't want to make the change. But otherwise you get this acceptance, and then you finally end up where you get some meaningful, you're engaged, you're going forward. And that's how the world tries to take some of these principles that I think are very biblical in nature, but it's how we are. And even to further look at this and to kind of buttress off what Michael was talking about, that denial state is everything. I just want everything to be the way it's been. Because how does a group of people that are enslaved want and ever say, wow, I wish I could just go back? But we just don't want to do it. We want everything to be like it is. It's just the fate of things. Then when you look at these others, it's disruption. That's the thing about change we don't like, is it is change. It's different. You don't know what's going to come. Fear is driving your primary motives with everything because you don't know what's coming. Or if you think you know, you're not sure it's going to be that way. Because that's my job, is I'm trying to assure people that we're making a change and this is going to be the end result. This is where we're going to be. And they're going, I don't necessarily believe you because I haven't seen it. I don't know it. My hope in this is very low at this point because I'd rather just things, and they may hate where they are. I've got people that hate what they're doing and the way they're doing it, but at the same time, they will fight tooth and nail to continue to do it, even if I'm offering them an option. But that's just human nature. And then you get into, in the final, you get to exploration where they talk about, so you start realizing you're going to do it, and then you start saying, how can I make this change work for me? How can I be a part of this? And this is in the idea of where you start getting engaged and you start recognizing, how am I going to participate in all this? And then finally you get into what's called the rebuilding. And you finally there, you've arrived. So in the idea of this story, the Israelites are over in number 1, 2, 3. That's where we are in the part of the story. They're in 1, 2, and 3. They're kind of sliding down there, and God's helping them, because what you realize from that is you have to do a lot of education. You have to do a lot of teaching, you have to do a lot of presentation, and that's what God's done. He's done the 10 plagues. He's done the Red Sea. He's saying, I've got you. I've got your back. You don't need to worry about any of this stuff. But yet still, human nature draws us back to these things in knowing that we're going to get to number 6, which is the promised land or heaven for us. Because we have to realize that we do the same thing every time we have to change. We go through these similar things in these phases. And once again, it's a continuum. You don't just run through them. It would be magical if you could just hit one, and when you're done, you check it off and you go on. This curve has another option where it goes, and instead of going up, it just goes down to 4, and it kind of stays there and just goes on and on and on. And that's when you decide you have no hope. People make a choice that they don't have any hope. And we see in the stories of the Israelites, there's some of those folks that go that way. They decide they're not going to listen, as Michael said, and they just do it the way they want to do it. And they don't have any acceptance of what needs to happen next. So with that, it comes to this question as I was going through my study. And Michael and I have been talking a lot about this, and we've been talking about this a lot. There's been a lot of suffering over the last in 2023. I thought 2020 was bad. I thought 21 was bad. 22 was bad. 23. It seems like there's always suffering. You can't get away from it. You can't find it. And so why do we suffer? And that is a question that every time I talk to anybody that's trying to fundamentally understand, why am I a Christian? Why does God allow these things to happen? That's a very common issue, and you can see it in a lot of places. But why do we suffer? And the thing is we suffer because suffering changes us. It's a fundamental thing, because God is changing them, and the bitter waters and the suffering that came with that, and the exasperation and the worry that they had with that, or when they're out in the wilderness and they're thirsting for all this water, God knew He carried them to those locations, knowing they were going to have these difficulties. But He knew in the end it was going to be a means to change who they were as individuals, as a nation, but suffering changes us. And so in that perspective, is where we as Christians can take suffering. We can look at all the things that happen into our lives, and we can put them in a framework that makes a choice that we have to make. Because there's really only a choice that comes through it and understanding it. Because in Romans 5, 3-5, it says, and not only that, but that we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. Now, hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who was given to us. That's a loaded set of verses there. But the key thing to understand with all that is it's saying that through suffering, we gain hope. We gain perseverance. And then with that hope will not disappoint, because what? The love of God. And this is where we're going to start going down some thoughts that I have about the love of God has been poured out into our hearts because God loves us. That is the critical difference factor between you and your coworker, your family member that is suffering the same things or maybe something different, but is suffering, and they don't have the love of God in their life. That is essentially what's going to make difference on how you're going to adjust to that. Because in the end, what suffering does, I believe, is it leaves us with a choice. And just like everything that I find in life that I try to make very complicated, and I try to make it where it's got all these options and how many different ways you can go, There's really only two choices when you have suffering. You can either choose hope or to be hopeless. And it's not to say that you don't start out one, doesn't mean that you don't start out hopeless. But in the end, you have to make a final decision that I'm going to choose, that I'm going to take this situation and I'm going to view it in a framework that God is doing this for a reason and that I need to look to him to make it through it, or I'm not going to look to God, I'm going to abandon God because I think God's abandoned me. And then with that, you're left with no hope. And that's where the world is. That's where the people I talk to, they don't have that. So whenever I talk to them and I try to put them an anchor on what they need to do, that's what they don't have. And so that's the challenge of trying to get them to the point where they even want to try to attach some hope to something, because the world doesn't offer it anymore. Satan will cover and hide and put anything in front of them that will hide that truth from them, because he's a liar and he's a thief. And he will work at every effort, and he will do it to us, and he's done it to me. I can tell you I'm ashamed the amount of times that I've walked into this building hopeless. And I've sat through a service and I was hopeless because I had made the choice to be hopeless. In front of all the evidence that was put in front of me, the 10 plagues, the destruction of the greatest power in the entire known world. And I chose to go, why? Why did you do this to me? Why is this happening to me? And what's really embarrassing is they weren't even really big things. They were just stuff that was just pretty annoying. It was just stuff I just didn't want to mess with anymore. I just, can I just get rid of this? It's really bothersome. But then you have to recognize with that, do we trust that God loves us? Because that's where I finally got to. When you come back to this, because like I said, this is a spectrum of things. But do we trust that he loves us? And do we really believe what Romans 8:28 says? And we know that all good things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And I've read this verse over and over and over again. And I think what we have to recognize is it says that we all know. It says there, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God. That's our part. We have to love him. We have to obey him. We have to listen to him. And when that happens, no matter what happens to us, he is going to work that it's going to be the betterment for us. So all the suffering, all the pain, all the difficulties that we live with each and every day, whether we are 5 years old, whether we're 15 years old, 55, 85, all those things accumulate that they make you a better person, because that's what God has promised us. Now, does it mean that you feel it right in the moment? I've never once been in a moment of suffering where I thought, wow, thanks. I appreciate that you're doing this. But I can say 2 years later, sometimes 10 years later, sometimes it's been 15 years later, I can go back and I see someone else in the same situation or a similar situation, and I have the context and understanding of what comes on the other side of that. And that's what happens when you get to be 50, because then you start realizing, I know a little bit, but I've messed up a lot more. So I can help other people not mess up so much. But we have to understand that, do we really believe what this says? But we have to understand that you have to love God to do this. If we don't love him, if we don't truly, because in those moments of hopelessness, I didn't believe God loved me, and so I decided that I didn't have to love him, because that's how we are. I wish I was different than a 2-year-old, but in the end, if you don't like me, I don't like you, that's how it's going to be on you. Because that's what the Israelites were doing in the face of all these things. They're just fundamental who we are. So with suffering brings strength and wisdom. So when we look at this in Romans 8:24 and 25, it says, we are saved in this hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For why does one still hope for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with perseverance. So when we talk about strength and wisdom, those are attributes that we all try to work for. Those are things we want. But I think the key thing about hope, when you're talking about hope or hopelessness, is the fact is hoping for something that you can see in front of you isn't really hope. Hope is something I can't see. It's something that's not in front of me, something that's beyond my vision, which for the Israelites, it's the idea that I'm going to be in another land that's going to be plentiful, and I'm going to be back in a situation that looks somewhat similar to what I just left, in a land where I had food, shelter, protection, all those core basic needs. That's what they're hoping for. That's what God promised them. But they had to have that hope because they could not see it. There was nothing in front of them that said that day when they walked into the wilderness, oh, I can see the city over there where I'm going to be. Just like we can't see heaven. We know it's there. I hope it's there. I have faith that it's there, but I can't see it. But every time something goes wrong in my life that I feel is wrong anyway, maybe that's not even really the best way to frame it. Maybe it's just stuff that's not going the way I anticipated it should go, the way I wanted it to be. But to know that hope that God is doing all things to work out for the betterment of me. That's how we as Christians can make it through all of these things and rationalize why things happen the way they happen. Because when you do hit that valley, when you're in that change, whatever it is, like I said, there's different people do different things. And when I've watched through my many years of change management, I've talked about there's folks that get stuck in the valley and they're terrified. They're just scared. They don't know what's coming next. They don't know if they're going to be good at it. A big part of a lot of this too is with change, I'm really competent, or at least I feel I'm pretty competent in what I'm doing right now. And if you change it, I may not be so good at it when that change comes. In fact, I may be lousy at it. And I don't really want to find out if I'm going to get good at it. I would just rather do what I'm doing. And it's even in our lives. Sometimes what we're doing is not great. In fact, it may be really wrong. But I know it and I'm pretty good at it. And it's comfortable for me. But a lot of times when we get to that valley, when we finally realize we need to make that change, what David says here is, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And so when you look at this, and the idea of this is, so when you're in that valley point, when you're in that lowest point, and you can't think, do you recognize that God is with you like David did? Because then you don't fear the change, the difference, the things that could happen to you. You don't fear it anymore. All of a sudden, you become this confident individual that's walking through all sorts of things, and people are saying, how can you manage that? I don't manage it. God's managing it because he's there with me, and he's taking care of us. And so with that, we prepare much stronger than we really are because God provides that to us when we look to him for that. And so hopefully we also end up with the wisdom that comes with this. And thinking of Simon Peter and his life, this guy loved change. He was all about it. He was ready to change something every time he had the chance to do it. And so I'm like, wow, this is great. These are the things. But we also see with that change, sometimes it doesn't keep him from doing the very things that seemed pretty bold at the time to be who he was, and then denied Christ 3 times on the eve of witnessing everything that had happened. But recognize this is where Peter was at, and he came back to this very idea. Because when they were speaking in the apostles were there, but Simon Peter, when talking to Christ here in John 6, he said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Also, we have come to believe and know that you are the Christ, the Son of God. He demonstrated the wisdom of knowing that when we have hope, who do we go to? There's only one person. It's, again, very simple. And Simon Peter said this, you go to you because you have the words of eternal life. And isn't that where our hope is all tied up? Isn't that why we're all here? We come here because we want to get recharged. We want to believe all the things that we have learned. And some here have known them for years and years. Others are just embarking on that journey. So we have everyone in all these different phases. We come together, and we're called to be together because that hope holds us together. Because we know Jesus is the answer for all of those things. So when we look at this and to start wrapping things up, I think the thing, if I give you the takeaways to look at today, is, sometimes there's bitter water. God had the answer. He just needed to let them figure out who they needed to go to fix it. They needed to understand who it was and who they should have hope in. And I think you see through all of these stories, the changes that they were having to do. I have a lot more compassion for them because I see myself in all these things. I see when these changes have come to me and when suffering comes to me that I want to resist it. But I would point out and recommend that if you get angry about anything, when you get to that point of anger and you're saying, I'm just done with this, I don't want this to happen. Maybe it's an awful thing. We've had terrible things happen over the course of this year to different people in this congregation. We've had saints that have gone home as they did in the course of their life. We've had others that have left before they even drew their first breath. We've had all sorts of other sufferings that have gone on with different things, separations of family, fractures of relationships. And all these things are just terrible. And they can be all-consuming, and they can just overwhelm. And they do overwhelm us if we let it. But with all that coming, we have this strength and this glory because we have the hope of knowing that all that ends through him for our own good. And so recognize the bitter water. And this is a hard thing. As James says, be glad that you have it. Because then you will be suffering and you will be changed and you will become more what God wants us to be. So I always like to find different people saying the same thing in different ways. And I think this is one thing that when I was looking through things, and Zig Ziglar is a guy that I listen to a lot. He's a good Christian man, and he's got a lot of wisdom on things. But he says, there are seldom, if ever, any hopeless situations. But there are many people who lose hope in the face of some of those situations. And I think that's the truth of it. I think when you go through things, you have a choice. It's either you have hope that you're going to make it through on the other side, and whatever you get to, God's got a plan in it. Or you can abandon God and say, this is just hopeless, and you move on, and then you just go off, because you've got two roads to go down. You get to that point where you make the choice. You're going to follow that God's in charge, or that God doesn't exist. And unfortunately, that's the two choices, because there's really nothing in the middle. Because if you sort of believe in God or don't believe in God, you really don't believe he exists, because you can't have that hope. It's not going to stand up to all the suffering. But even more importantly, whatever happens, he said here, don't lose hope of the two main ropes of life, hope and faith. You know, when I look at that and I think the idea of rope and you're holding on to things, and I see what he's saying here is you've got these two, hope and faith. They go so close together because you know that faith, hope, and love, and we've talked about God's love. But faith and hope are those things that we hold on to because, one, we believe who God is. We understand who he is. And we have the hope that we're going somewhere together with him. And sometimes, brothers and sisters, when we get to that point, you can't hold onto that rope anymore. You need somebody else to go and put your hand over yours and help you hold on to that rope till you get past that point. Because that's what's happened for me. And I'm sure that's happened for many of you, not all of you at some point. But we have to recognize that's what we need to be for each other. We need to make sure that we're all holding on to these things, because that's the key to getting us all to the promised land. That's how we all make it, because there's going to be suffering. We're going to wander in the wilderness. We're going to have all these things that go on in our lives. But through this, God, through that suffering, changes us and makes us a better people. I appreciate your kind attention on this. And I think we talked about this, is that Suffering changes us. It's our choice how we respond. You know, and if you have this morning, we had a response, someone made that choice. And I believe made the right choice. If anyone else has any issues, any sufferings where they want the prayers of the church, we're here to offer an opportunity for that. But we all make a choice every time we wake up every morning of what we're going to do. We're going to believe and trust in God or we're not. And from that affects how we go the rest of our lives. So again, if anyone has any needs, if you wish to be baptized, come forward as we stand and sing this song.